Thanks, Bowden. As Bowden said, my name's Tania. I'm from North Melbourne Footy Club, and I'm glad you said it was a last minute put together, because it was also sort of a bit of a rush in deciding what to present today based on that. But I guess I'll just start with a bit of a thank you, I guess, to Catapult and Valve, because it's always nice to get out of the office and get out of the day-to-day and have a chat to some other people and see what's happening in the industry. So I'm really looking forward to today, and you've put together a pretty good list of, outside of myself obviously, good speakers, so I'm looking forward to it. I don't mind being first cab off the rank either, because by this afternoon everyone will forget what I've spoken about. So anyway, we'll get into it. So I guess I was having a think about, after speaking to Chris and Bowden, what to present today, and it got me thinking about doing a bit of a stock take, I guess personally, but also at the club and then industry-wide, about where we're actually at currently with using wearable technologies in team sport. It's existed for a little while now, still relatively young, but where are we actually up to? What is best practice, or what is even considered successful practice in the use of technology, in the use of wearable tracking technology in team sport? So I did a good old Google search and came up with this figure that some of you may have seen before. I came across it when it was published a couple of years ago and haven't thought too much of it since. But basically what it shows is the increase in publications that used GPS in sport since its initiation back in 2001. So that's a long time ago now. We're obviously missing the last 4 years there, but that's almost 18 years now that GPS has been used in sport to some degree. What you can see though is this clear increase or spike around here in the 2009-10 mark, and then obviously an exponential increase from there. It also got me thinking about this one, which most of you have probably seen, which is one of Martin Boucher's figures. Basically what it's summarising, or what it's trying to explain, is the issue we have in sports science between applied settings, or what we're actually doing in the field, and research, or what would be considered traditional research, so uni or institute-based publications. The main issue being the time frame. So what you can see here is by the time there's an idea, which may or may not stem from professional sport in the first place, ethics approval, getting the right researchers to execute the program, recruitment process, draft manuscripts, which we all know can take years of back and forth with reviewers. You're talking years before anyone's actually seen the fruits of your labour, or what the research actually suggested. Whereas what happens a lot of the time in day-to-day is you get a question from a coach and he wants an answer that afternoon. Some projects are a little bit different. Some projects you might be working on for 6 months or 12 months, but more often than not, we're talking days or weeks for most of the analysis that goes on internally. So I think we're getting a lot better in this space. I think there's a lot of really good collaborations now between institutes, unis and clubs, and at least that the ideas or the types of questions are coming from real life applied settings, but we seem to be backing that up with some thorough research processes, which is really important too. So thinking about sort of these two figures, and particularly the first one around the research publications using GPS, I did what's really fashionable these days, which is a word cloud, basically word vomit of what do you think about when you think about using tracking data in sport, or GPS data in sport. And these are probably the most common one, things like load monitoring or performance analysis. If you think about the timeline that I showed a couple of slides ago, back in 2001, where there was only a handful of papers for the first few years, a lot of that stuff was around reliability and validity. So we were looking for things like, did GPS actually measure what it was telling us it measured? Were different metrics as reliable as each other, or were some metrics less reliable or less valid? We worked out that sampling rate was pretty important pretty early, and that improvements in sampling rate and hardware and software meant that over the years we got pretty comfortable with the reliability and validity of using tracking data in professional sport. We also had a period there where we were looking at things like how we collect the information, so the importance of where we're wearing the unit, how we're wearing it, whether we're wearing it in the garments or the jerseys, things like inter-unit reliability, so do we wear the same unit on the same player every time. That was a lot of the early research. Then in about 2009 or 10, at least in AFL and probably a little bit later in some of the other codes, clubs started getting access real readily it was really readily accessible, the GPS units. So we were basically tracking every player for almost every session. Early days, a lot of that research was more around quantifying the demand. So we were either tracking matches, if you were allowed to in your code, and trying to understand what matches actually looked like, or we were tracking training, but we might have only been tracking half the group or half the sessions or particular drills. Over time, everyone got access to probably a full set of units where you can track everything your athletes are doing. And that's where this explosion in about 2010, 12 of load monitoring came. So we all tried to do what I think we've all been trying to do for well before we were all around, which is either prevent injury or improve performance. But now that we had an objective measure of load, or we think we do, we're trying to predict it using research. I think a little bit newer, in my opinion, and still a long way to go, is this idea of performance analysis or match analysis. I think we're working towards some improvements in the technology of being able to overlay tactical elements of the game, so things like game state, offense and defense, things like positional differences, and I think we'll get a lot better with that as things like the champion data and Catapult relationship improve, for those of you in AFL anyway. But that's still a fairly young area, in my opinion. Anyway, so we've got all of this, we've got lots of ways to use the technology, but do we actually know what the recipe is? So, jumped ahead of myself here, but we've got all the ingredients or potential ingredients, but do we know where to focus our attention or our resources or our money, for those of us who have budgets to work with? So it brought me to this, if it opens.
If you write anything on your computer, you need to get grammar.
Yeah. I have to exit. There we go. Presentation mode. I watched this when I was a kid and I just thought it's probably how a lot of us feel a lot of the time. Does anyone ever feel like they're doing this? So I guess you probably get what I'm referring to there, but there's this idea that we've got all of this information, or what we think is all of this information, and we've got ways that we could possibly use it, but do we actually know the best way to use it? And how many people could confidently say they are currently successfully implementing the use of wearable technology, let alone at what you would consider a best practice version of implementing wearable technology? So I think if anyone got asked this question, and it's a bit of a taboo or a sensitive term sometimes, this idea of evidence-based practice, but we all want to say, yes, we're doing it in some way, shape or form. So what I thought about today, getting to the point, is I decided I would take you through the process that we at North Melbourne, or at least one process that we went through in trying to transfer a little bit of evidence-based research and something that we think is relatively novel or starting out into an applied setting and putting our own little take on something that exists. So for those of you who jumped ahead, what I'm going to present for the next sort of 10 is this idea that we can measure neuromuscular fatigue or some sort of change in gait or movement pattern in athletes using GPS or wearable technology, probably more so the accelerometer data. It all started back in 2013, so this Mooney and Cormack group, where they somewhat accidentally fell across this. They were looking at, correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone on the panel on the author list is here, but they were looking at performance metrics and the influence that neuromuscular fatigue measured by the traditional metric of flight time to contraction time, whether that had any influence on performance or match intensity. What they found was that there was definitely a decoupling of the relationship between load metrics, so player load per minute, and total distance or locomotor metrics. They also found that this often influenced performance measured by coaches' votes. So the conclusion was that the players were changing something about the way they were moving in matches when they were fatigued. And that was linked to changes in the accelerometer metrics. So I don't expect you to sort of read this slide, obviously, there's a lot in there, but I guess I'm just trying to show you the process of what we went through at North Melbourne, which is we had a look at where the research currently was in this. So they were the first two papers in 2013, but has anyone looked at it since and what have they found? Basically there were seven papers that looked in some way, shape or form at the idea of being able to measure gait changes wearing a GPS tracker or a GPS tracker, and they all essentially found some sort of relationship. The first two up there are the ones that I just referred to before. Then there was one by Martin Boucher who talked about it wasn't specifically to performing a standardised protocol or test. It was literally wearing a GPS unit while walking over a force-plated treadmill, and he looked at whether you could detect changes in stride variables of vertical stiffness and the relationship between the GPS and the treadmill force plate, and found some pretty decent correlations. Even though that was the least specific of the studies, I liked it because it was probably the most scientific of the studies and showed us what a gold standard metric of gait analysis or vertical stiffness, how that compared to the GPS wearing it so far away from your feet or your lower limbs, obviously. Two here in 2016 from the same group looked at match, it was soccer, and they looked at match, a simulated match protocol and an actual match protocol, and looked at whether there were changes in your player load metrics or your accelerometer metrics under fatigue. Their definition of fatigue, or I guess their way of exploring fatigue, was more about game state, so later stages of halves or second half to first half. And then the one that's probably the most influential, or the one that we use to base a lot of our protocols on, is this more recent one here in 2018. And basically what this study looked at, if anyone hasn't sort of heard of it, is can a small-sided gain, so it wasn't even a standardised protocol to the point of a prescription, it was a standardised gain, it was a small-sided gain, so players free to move where they wanted. Can neuromuscular fatigue, determined by flight time to contraction time, detect changes in the way players accumulate load in a small-sided gain? Basically, all of that came to these take-home messages for us anyway. That wearables can detect changes in movement patterns. What is it detecting? Is it stiffness? Is it change in stride variables? Is it asymmetries? We probably don't know that yet. There's only been 8 studies in the area, but it's detecting something. Even when you're wearing it, one of the studies I should have mentioned earlier did look at the difference between wearing a unit at centre of mass versus scapula, and even in those two locations, it still found the scapula can detect changes. So the relationship between locomotor metrics, so things like total distance or high-speed running, and your accelerometer metrics, it's definitely influenced under fatigue. Almost all of the studies agreed with that. Generally, the relative player load metrics were reduced under fatigue measured by the flight time to contraction time in some of those papers. One of the studies showed a slightly different relationship, the one in soccer match simulation, where it showed that there was an increase in player load relative to total distance. The difference being, or the rationalisation that we came up with there, was that looking at a match simulation, there's obviously a much longer time period. So that study was looking at later stages of within a half or second half to first half, whereas the technique we're sort of going for, or the protocol we're going for, and the 2017 paper is much smaller time periods, detecting more of a chronic fatigue, so to speak, rather than an acute fatigue within one session or one match. So we sort of were looking for the idea that reduced player load metrics might be suggesting fatigue. The other one was this idea that the contribution of the different vectors of player load changed under fatigue. So most of the studies also agreed that the mediolateral vector was increased under fatigue and the vertical vector was decreased. The last paper in 2017, Amber Rao's paper, also looked at whether she split her season loads into high and low just based on the average and looked at whether there were changes in her player load metrics based on high and low load weeks. Interestingly, what she found was she actually had higher player load metrics in the high load weeks. But what they also found is that flight time to contraction time was not different between those high weeks or low weeks. So their conclusion was that high weeks are not actually high enough to solely be responsible for the neuromuscular fatigue that they do see when flight time to contraction time is reduced. So what did we do? Those of you who work with a club or at a sport would know we don't make any decisions by ourselves. We've got a team to work with. So together with the conditioning coaches, we basically came up with this idea that where in the week can we fit a standardised protocol, a standardised activity or prescription that would help us collect this sort of data. So we already had in place a submaximal recovery run, so 2 days post-game or around 48 hours after a match, we already had a recovery protocol in place, which we actually used for heart rate recovery analysis, which we'd been doing for a couple of years. What we were doing, however, is we were doing a steady state version of it. So it was a little bit harder to standardise because it's hard to standardise speed when they're running around an oval, and it was steady state, there was no change direction, albeit submaximal. So what we did last year is we changed it to a version of the yo-yo. So it's still submaximal, it's only at 13 k's an hour, so they don't even need a warm-up to do it, but we've added that extra layer of standardising because it's to the beep as you do in the yo-yo recording, and we've added the acceleration component. That was a little bit of a guess. I figured that if the rationale of why we're seeing these changes in player load metrics is because of a change in the way they're accumulating acceleration or stride lengths, I thought it might be a little bit more sensitive if you add the added element of change direction as opposed to just getting into a steady state running around an oval. So we do it, like I said, 2 days post-match. So obviously the first layer is understanding your own data, and this is just our coefficient of variations for the different metrics. I put in total distance there, which you can see actually has the lowest coefficient of variation, but that makes sense because it's the exact same protocol that they do every week. And then the other ones there. Generally, you would say these are pretty good. They're all under 10, which is what we would say is considered reliable. Interestingly, player load slow has the biggest variation, and so what that led me to is to explore the actual data and understand how can some players get such different values if they're doing the same test. So that brought me, I'll go back one more step. This metric here, player load per metre per minute, is one that came out of the 2017 paper where they explored the relative relationship between player load and distance relative to time. And that's the one that they actually found that had a pretty decent relationship to fatigue or to flight time to contraction time. So, jumping ahead here, these are the sort of things that you deal with when you're working with real data, and I think it's pretty important that you're checking your data and you're cleaning your data. So, for example, I went through and had some players who had much higher coefficient variations than the group averages that I just showed, and went back and looked at the live trace and, Catapult, but found cases like this. So this is what you'd consider like signal loss, and so if the red line is a velocity trace and the green line is player load, what you can see is that the player is still accumulating player load because you don't need GPS signal for that, but we lost GPS signal for 2 efforts here. And what happens is, so your player load coefficient of variation is fine, your distance is affected, and then even more so exponentially, your player load per metre per minute and player load slow, because correct me if I'm wrong, if you lose GPS signal, player load starts to accumulate under player load slow because there's no velocity trace. So I had some spikes in the metrics like player load slow or player load meters per minute because of little errors like this. That's fine, you just have to go through and clean your data. The other thing to consider, I was just having a chat to David earlier, is this idea that we think we've got big data, but when you're in our setting, you actually want to understand things at the most, the most detailed level, and you want to understand things for your player in your year or in that day. And what happens is we have plenty of players who aren't actually capable of doing an on-legs dose 2 days after a game. They've either been injured and they're still recovering from that. It's a load management strategy that they don't train 2 days in a row, whatever it might be. The other interesting one, which you can't do much about, is if you have Friday night games, it affects some teams more than us. But Friday night matches means 2 days falls on a Sunday and we give them a Sunday off. So we're not getting them in to do this protocol on a Sunday. We had 3 this year. So already your potential of 23, we haven't played round 23 yet, but your 23 matches is already at 20 before you even start losing data for either of these other reasons. So the volume of data and the sample size is actually not as big as we like to think. So this is the, comparison of high load to low load for us, similar to the stuff that Amber did in the 2017 paper. Interestingly, reassuringly, but I don't know, maybe surprisingly, because if your gut told you that player load metrics would go down under fatigue, you might expect that higher load weeks would result in lower player load metrics in the standardised recovery run. We actually found, just like Amber did, that most of our metrics went up. 2 of them went up to what you'd consider at least a small effect, to probably negligible or trivial effects. Keep in mind that of 46 players, only 24 players are used in this analysis, because I wanted to make sure I had enough data. So to do an effect size, you obviously need a standard deviation. So technically you can do a standard deviation with two data points, but that's got issues in itself. So I set a completely made up and arbitrary threshold of having at least 3 high and 3 low, and got the standard deviation from the 6 variables to at least have some consistency of data. So if we're looking there, we've got player load per minute and player load 2D per minute, which had increases or seemed to have a trend in the relationship between load and the recovery run protocol. So I took it a step further and wanted to look at the individual guys or the individual athletes in my group, and this is what we came up with. So this is that first metric, player load per minute, this is effect size, and these are my 24 players. So you can see that there's somewhat of a lean towards the right, so most players had higher player load per minute on the high load weeks, but there's certainly exceptions to the rule, and particularly these 2 here who have substantial, large effects in the opposite direction. Anyone know why? I don't. But that's what happens. You end up with data that, and I think that's the take-home message there, is that when you're working in the applied setting, you need to go a step further than the average or the group trends, because you end up with situations like this. So if I now track this player and look for changes in a certain direction to reflect fatigue in him, that might not make sense. The next metric, player load 2D, similar trend. Most of the players moved to the right. The ones I highlighted in orange there are just the ones that also went in the negative direction in the previous metric. Only 4 of the 7. So there were some players that actually went in one direction for one metric, but the other direction for the other metric. This doesn't help me very much, because apart from being descriptive, what I actually want to do with this information is use it to intervene or use it to make a decision about how our players are tracking. So in order to do that, once I got comfortable with the idea that they were sort of reproducible and sort of reliable, our metrics, and that we might be seeing some sort of trend in our metrics, we started looking at the data like this year. So basically what I've done there is I've got my 2 metrics. I've got the coefficient of variation thresholds, and I've got round at the bottom. So keep in mind that a couple of the studies that I touched on earlier, they referenced baseline values, and that's something we don't have. You might argue that can we get a baseline in pre-season, but the counter argument would be that that's actually when their loads are at their highest. You might say, what about JLT series or our pre-season matches? But we went from JLT, our first game of JLT, into a 3-day community camp, into our second round of JLT, so didn't have access to our players. So we don't have baseline. The approach we take instead in cases like this is we look for change from norm. So we look for, is there any significant or substantial variations from what they normally might produce? I don't know which week here he's fatigued or he's not, or he's feeling great or he's best prepared. I'm using other information I've got to try and make inferences. And what I can tell you is that something's going on here and something might be going on here, but I can't tell you what it is by looking at this chart. So what I do from there is I have a look at the other techniques we have, or the other monitoring techniques that most of us probably do and have been doing for a while. So something like this, which is our internal to external load ratio, which also uses GPS and a wearable tracking technology. We chart for every player. This, I will add, just to my previous slide, that I clearly chose the chart that was the most interesting to show you. We have many players that had no relationship, or players that only had 3 data points, or players that had such big spikes that you couldn't pick a trend in anything. So I clearly showed you one of the maybe 5 instances this year where we actually used the information to help us. But that's what you do in presentations. So that player, and then this is the same player. So we had a look at, okay, how is he tracking for his internal to his external load ratio? And is there anything in that that might line up with what we're seeing in his recovery protocol? So this week here, just a quick overview, most of you probably know this, but basically what we're saying is that when we're outside of these sort of grey thresholds, the relationship between internal and external load has changed for that player, and probably more relevant is if we're above the line, because we're saying that their internal load is higher for the same external load. And this player did have one of the weeks of the 2 I showed earlier where he was outside somewhat of his normal relationship between internal and external load. The second week is smack bang in the middle there in week 14, so that didn't help me very much, but we certainly had 1 week where he was outside of his normal ratio. The next step to this, which is also what I'm sure a lot of you are probably doing, is the day that we realised this, which was a 2 days post-game, and our players do a subjective wellness every morning. We just had a look at how he thought he was feeling. Did he feel like he was tracking worse than usual for 2 days post-game? And what we saw there is that he certainly had negative Z scores for a lot of his subjective wellness metrics. Now, anyone who uses wellness regularly knows that you probably get 10 players like this every day, and you probably get 1 player like this 3 times a week. So that in itself might not have been cause for a huge intervention. But when you start adding the 3 pieces of information together, at the very least it promotes a conversation, which is what we did. We had a chat to physios, anyone who's clinically treated him, his coaches, his conditioning coaches, how's he been going in the gym and whatnot. If anyone did the maths, week 13 and 14 led into our bye, so we actually did nothing at all because they had half the week off anyway. But I guess the take-home message there is that a lot of what we do, going back to the Mr. Bean video, is a little bit of, we've got a lot of ingredients, we've got a lot of information, and we're sort of trying to work our way through how can it guide our decision-making. I'm all for the idea of using evidence-based practice and research that currently exists, but as you can see, there's a lot of limitations in and time restraints in by the time you can actually implement that in your own sample. So basically what I thought, being that we are a relatively small group, is rather than questions per se, but I'm open to questions, is more of a discussion on, is anyone doing anything like this? Has anyone played with the idea of gait changes or detecting neuromuscular fatigue using wearable technology? Do I have time for that? 4 minutes. So yeah, happy to take questions, but also just comments, thoughts, feelings and experience if anyone's been using it.